exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Hallelujah! Hallelujah! You should be visited by the Lord of Hosts with earthquakes, thunder, and great noise, with storms and tempests, and the flame of devouring fire. Hallelujah!
Wow! Hey, Tim! Now, I didn't know you were such a holy roller. The way you were preaching, you'd think the world was coming to an end.
Well, look all around us. The world is on fire. The gates have opened, and Satan is upon us.
Okay. Calm down. I think you're being just a little overly dramatic. Now, I believe a cow is turned over a lantern and set a barn on Mrs. O'Leary's property on fire, and maybe some people have spontaneously combusted. But I don't think it's the end of the world.
I hear tell from our guests tonight that the fires are widespread, that they've sprung up all over the place and are increasing in intensity. The earth is on fire, I tell you. Satan has arisen.
Okay, whatever you say. But, hey, let's go ahead and head back to the KCORradio studios in Vegas and find out from our guest, Larry Arnold, what's really going on.
I tell you, it's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world, and I feel fine.
All right, we should put you down as a lounge singer there, Tim. That's pretty good.
Well, hey, you could play drums behind me or something like that. Right?
Yeah, you wouldn't want that. We get my daughter; she'll play saxophone for you.
All right, whoa, we're getting the band going already.
There you go. Right.
Well, I have played. We had a band at a couple of our conferences there in Phoenix. That the late Fred Bell helped us put together. We had Patrick Mraz, who used to play with, I believe, the band Yes and the Moody Blues, and Jim Delatoso was in on it, and my buddy Blue Ocean, and I sang a couple of songs there, and it's all grand. But anyway, the night marches on, and we've got a great guest tonight, and a really fiery subject.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm really excited that we were able to get Larry Arnold on our show tonight. I've been wanting to have Larry on for quite some time, so it's just I'm really pleased that he's joined us. Now, just a little bit of an introduction for anybody. Now, Larry founded Parascience International in 1976 to pursue the exploration of Fortean anomalies in consciousness. Now, his controversial article published in August of 1978 titled Meltdown at TMI number 2 would 8 months later be termed uncannily accurate by the New York Times in presaging the future of the nuclear power plant's meltdown near his home. Larry is the author of 3 pioneering books: The Parapsychological Impact of the Accident of 3 Mile Island. I wrote that in 1980. The Ricky Handbook, which he wrote in 1982, and Ablaze, The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion. Now, he's regarded by some of the world's experts on spontaneous human combustion, and consequently by others, as Larry puts it, as he's a world-class fool, but I don't think so. And after the end of the show, I don't think our audience will either. Now, Larry's been guest on hundreds of radio and internet radio programs, now including Exploring the Bizarre. He's also appeared on programs for numerous television networks, and he's lectured all over the place about the paranormal, and has been published in magazines such as Fate, Fortean Times, Info Journal, Life, Pennsylvania Association of Arson Investigators newsletter. Let's see, what else? UFO Annual, UFO Reports, and of course the infamous UFO universe.
There you go. Well, I remember the day that I purchased a copy of Ablaze. And most people don't remember when it was that they purchased the book or where they purchased it, but I remember. I was headed down the Jersey Shore, and I wanted something to read. And there was a used bookstore that we stopped in, and I believe the only book on the paranormal in the whole place was Larry's book, and it was huge. I mean, we put out some pretty thick tomes there, Tim, but
Yep.
this one was pretty close to 500 pages, and it was hardcover, and the price was right. And so I purchased it, and I sat out in the sun and read at least part of the book. Certainly couldn't do it in a couple of days, but it's a tremendous book, and probably the only complete work on the topic. Now, I want to get into a couple of discussions here this evening. Of course, we want to talk about spontaneous human combustion, but I'm also intrigued by Larry's investigation of the Chicago fire. Back in issue number 2 of UFO Universe, we published an article that Larry did on this topic. But I think, Larry, the first thing I want to know is, how did you become fascinated with the Fortean phenomena and in things related to fires? I mean, it seems to be a relatively a real niche topic here for somebody to explore.
Hi, Timothy and Tim. It's great to be with you guys. You gentlemen certainly have extraordinary credentials to explore the bizarre, and we are honored with this opportunity to share with you and your audience tonight some of the research that we've done in this, as you say, niche area of the truly bizarre. We're going to be embarking on an examination of and an exploration of one of nature's more extraordinary phenomena that mainstream science finds utterly mysterious and inexplicable, as well as unacceptable. What got us introduced to the phenomenon? What got us introduced to the phenomenon and become interested in it was a book that we read in junior high school called Stranger Than Science by Frank Edwards.
Oh, yeah.
And in that book, he had a chapter about incredible incinerations, and he spoke specifically about a woman named Mary Hardy Reeser. And as we took an interest in how she died supposedly mysteriously by this thing called spontaneous human combustion, as with you in buying our book when you went to the shore, we never forgot about what we read in junior high school. And as we went through the academic structure, we would ask our teachers and later our professors in college, had they ever heard about this? Any ideas? Nope, never heard about it. Didn't know a thing about it. So that kept us curious, and when we left college and kind of changed professions from engineering to focus more on the paranormal, the Fortean aspects of this amazing world in which we all cohabit, our mind brought us back to this thing we read in junior high school about SponCom, and we went to the Library of Congress to see whether Frank Edwards, the author of Stranger Than Science, had made up this chapter about Mrs. Reeser, or whether he based his chapter writing on a real event. And in plowing through microfilm at the Library of Congress, looking at copies of the St. Petersburg Times and the Tampa Tribune from 1951, we discovered that Frank Edwards didn't make anything up. He reported this amazing story of Mrs. Reeser's phenomenal transition by fire, matter-of-factly. And we thought what would end up being a weekend of library work at the Library of Congress in D.C. has transformed into a decades-long career that has spanned the globe, us traveling the world, talking to hundreds of fire investigators, first responders, physicians, medical examiners, survivors, and eyewitnesses to this amazing yet extraordinarily macabre subject that history has termed spontaneous human combustion.
And okay, so now also too, I remember reading, of course, Frank Edwards' book, but also there was another writer, Vincent Gaddis. I'm sure you're probably familiar with his work.
Indeed.
Mysterious Fires
and Light.
The lights, yeah. Okay. Well, now, did you actually investigate this case? I mean, did you call the police department or anything down there to confirm?
Yes, we have investigated the Reeser case extensively. Our file on the Reeser case is more than an inch thick. One of our critics likes to call us a mystery monger. We don't need to monger the mystery here. The mystery is real. It mongers itself. We have communicated with the St. Pete Police Department over the years, as well as the fire department. We're actually able to track down one of the two firefighters, one of the two first responders who helped shovel up Mrs. Reeser's ashes from her apartment in St. Pete back in the morning of July 2, 1951. And as Nelson Ader told us, to the best of his ability as a firefighter with decades of experience fighting fatal fires as well as conventional house blazes, he had never before, nor since his encounter with Mrs. Reeser's ash and remains, been to a fire scene that anywhere came close to remotely resembling what he encountered that day in 1951. And in his professional opinion, Mrs. Reeser died by none other than spontaneous human combustion.
Now, was the only thing that was left of her that wasn't an ash a foot? Or am I thinking of another case?
You're pretty close. The photographs that we have of her remains consist of 1 foot, the satin slipper that was encased on the foot, a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, and a skull that was said by the first responders at the time to have shrunk to the size of a teacup, grapefruit, or baseball. Everything else was limited in terms of fire damage to what was called a circle of death that was no more than about 3 feet in diameter.
Well, now, okay, the human body, if somebody pours gasoline on a person and sets them ablaze, I mean, you see this on TV all the time in these crime shows. How long does it take for a body to burn, and what temperature must it reach in order for it to turn to ash? I mean, it sounds like something you would do in a crematorium.
You certainly can do that in a crematorium, and that's an excellent question to pose in the context of the subject under discussion. In arson murders where gasoline or some other accelerant is used to cover up the crime scene, so to speak, by the perpetrator, it can take several hours to sort of incinerate the body. And yet, if you talk to someone who's an expert in taphonomy, as is Elaine Pope, or you talk to Dr. Wilton Marion Krogman, as we did, who was involved in the Reeser case back in 1951, he was a internationally renowned forensic anthropologist who had conducted a number of experiments on what are the effects of fire on the human body, because this is really important to crime scene investigators. Elaine Pope will tell you that even in the most severe arson murder cases, there are always parts of the body left that you could identify and look within for evidence of foul play: stab wounds, gunshot wounds, severe beatings of the body before the cadaver was burned, an attempt to cover up the crime evidence. In Dr. Krogman's case, he told us that in his experiments to replicate the kind of damage that was found in Mary Reeser's apartment would require him to burn a cadaver in a retort for 12 hours uninterrupted at temperatures approaching 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in order to fully ashen a body. That is much more extreme conditions than a retort normally fires up the body, so to speak. In crematoriums, normally the retort temperature is in the vicinity of 22 to 2,400 degrees for about 90 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the mass of the body. And then the retort temperature is lowered to 17 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for another hour and a half to 2.5 hours. And even at those heightened temperatures, and in perspective, molten rock coming out of a volcano has a temperature of about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're talking high heat here. And yet what comes out of a normal crematorium retort oven is not just dust and ash, but large bone fragments that are not burned completely, not completely calcined, which are put in a device called a cremulator, fancy name for a bone grinder, to produce the proverbial ash and dust that is given to the next of kin in the presentation urn. So we're talking extraordinary temperatures here. Even in house fires, rarely do temperatures exceed 17 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the Reeser case, as in hundreds of other cases that we've been able to document, you find these what appears to be evidence of extraordinary heat, but relegated, very isolatedly relegated to the body itself, surrounding combustibles. As in the Reeser case, there were linen on the daybed near her body, stacks of newspaper nearby that did not incinerate, were not even singed. The fire in the Reeser case was relegated to about that 3-foot diameter area that consisted or contained the night before her body and the chair in which she was known to be seated.
Now, did she live in an apartment building, or was it a home?
She did live in an apartment building in St. Pete, Florida. She lived at one end of the hallway. Her landlady, Pansy Carpenter, at the time was living at the other end of the hallway. To the best of our knowledge, the other two housing units were empty at the time. There was a telegram that was delivered to Mrs. Reeser the morning of July 2. The Western Union delivery person handed the telegram to Mrs. Reeser. She walked down, to Mrs. Pansy Carpenter, who walked down the hallway to, rap on Mrs. Reeser's door and hand her the telegram. Pansy found the door handle to Mrs. Reeser's apartment too hot to touch. She screamed. Two painters who were walking across the street responded to the screaming and broke the door down to discover this amazing fire scene in which Mrs. Reeser's body was in an extraordinarily isolated fire scene. That was
no signs of smoke, no signs of smoke or anything.
Correct. Also atypical of a normal human fatal fire scene, there was no noxious odor present at that fire scene in the apartment at the time. Normally, burning human bodies have a, let's say, unpleasant, noxious stench to them. In cases that fit the definition of spontaneous human combustion, we find either no such odor. Rather, we find either the absence of an odor at all or the presence of what has been described often to us as a sweet, redolent, perfume-like scent at the burn scene.
Now, how many cases of spontaneous combustion would you estimate that there are?
When we began our research, the answer to that question was likely zero, because mainstream fire science and mainstream medicine absolutely refused to believe that the phenomenon could occur, so therefore there could be no evidence of it. There could be no cases for it. However, in the research that we've conducted over now 4 decades and still counting, we have found 500 cases approximately that fit the definition, the concept of spontaneous human combustion. Some of those cases are unique to our research and really belie the mainstream orthodox belief that SHC is impossible. The cases such as Mrs. Reeser, Dr. Bentley here in Pennsylvania, Helen Conway also here in Pennsylvania, and hundreds of cases around the world fit the definition that the human body is capable of blistering, smoking, or otherwise burning in the absence of a known nearby external source of ignition, which is our definition of spontaneous human combustion.
Now, has anybody, it seems to me that I heard on the radio many years ago, and I don't have all the details in my memory, that someone was walking down the street and caught on fire. Are there cases in your files where people have caught on fire and have been witnessed?
Yes, indeed. We have many cases. We have 2 chapters in Ablaze devoted to witnessed cases of spontaneous human combustion. This is a subset of the research that we've done into the phenomena that really irks the debunkers and the naysayers. Because if you're going to dismiss the evidence that we've accumulated from the eyewitnesses, both historical cases and cases that we've been able to personally interview the eyewitnesses, you've got to call all these people liars. And that's really risky to do. What the witnesses report historically or have told us personally, when they see a case of SHC occurring, Oftentimes the body is engulfed in what they describe to us, or has been described historically, as a bright electric blue colored flame or light. We have a few cases where that light has been described as silver in color, golden color, bluish green, but the predominant number of cases where the event has been witnessed, this bright electric blue color is reported. In survivor cases, some of the more extreme cases that have produced severe third, even fourth degree burn injuries to the survivor's body, either the body is not observed during the process of burning itself. The case of Jack Angel from 1974, a traveling salesman who slept through his severe charring that burned his right forearm. He awakened to
ghastly. That's ghastly.
It's ghastly, yeah. He awakened with no pain, no sensation.
Think to describe it, yeah.
What a nightmare to wake to, eh? Other survivors and witnesses tell us that they will see the body smoking, or they will feel a light heat rising up their spinal column, through their arms or limbs perhaps, and smoking ensues, perhaps producing a first or maybe second degree burn. But they are not standing near any source of known external fire or ignition that can produce the phenomena that they report to us.
Now, okay, well, it sounds like from what you're describing, this is an internal process, but is it possible? I mean, somebody suggested today Tesla's death ray, right? I might have been involved in some of these cases. Is it possible that some of these people might have been zapped by external sources?
We certainly believe that some of the cases can be explained, or simply we can hypothesize that the causation for some of the burn cases that fit the definition of spontaneous human combustion do result from an external ignition source, one that is not known to the victim, certainly not known to mainstream conventional orthodox Western science. The U.S. military does have the technology to internally heat targeted humans at a distance. Whether that can explain any of the more recent cases of spontaneous human combustion events, we're not in a position to say because we don't have that level of security clearance. But certainly that technology cannot be applied to the cases that date from the 15, 16, 17, and 1800s.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's the most recent case that you're aware of?
Interesting question. The most recent case that we're willing to stake our research and reputation on is a case that we personally investigated in Oklahoma in 2013. The victim was Danny Van Zant. The synopsis of that case very quickly is that one of his relatives living next door noticed some smoke coming out of the eave of Danny's home. The home was locked up at the time. Another relative broke into the home, and in the smoky haze of the kitchen
All right, we're going to
area,
have to, Larry, we're going to have to interrupt you here because we're coming up to our bottom of the hour break. We'll continue this conversation in just a few minutes.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre. I'm Tim Swartz. Tonight, we're talking with Larry Arnold about spontaneous human combustion and other mystery fires. Okay, so Larry, you were telling us probably one of the most recent cases that you were working on before we had to rudely interrupt you to go to our break. So you can go ahead and continue.
Yeah, real succinctly, the case of Danny Van Zant happened on February 18, 2013. We made a trip out to Sequoia County in eastern Oklahoma to meet with the first responders, the county sheriff, who was mystified. He used the word bizarre when it came to describing the fire scene in Mr. Van Zant's home. As we said at the bottom of just before the bottom of the hour break, Mr. Van Zant's relative broke into Danny's home and confronted what he first thought was a trash bag fire in the kitchen. He attempted to shovel up the trash bag and get it out of the home, when at that point we believe he realized that what he was about to shovel up was not a burning bag of trash, but was Mr. Van Zandt himself. Mm. The first responders arrived within minutes to a fire scene where there was no fire for them to put out. Real succinctly, the burn damage was relegated almost wholly to Mr. Van Zandt himself. The debunkers of spontaneous human combustion inveigh the following arguments. In the recent case that involved Dr. Krogman, where he had done experiments burning the body at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit to completely ashen it, he said such fire scenes are impossible. Had he not personally investigated the recent case, he would have dismissed it as a hoax. Dr. Adelson, a medical examiner, claims that all photographs that purportedly depict localized, wholly ashen fire scenes involving human beings are hoaxes. Dr. Benecke is, like Dr. Krogman himself, a world-renowned forensic biologist, claims emphatically that there is no case ever in history in which internal organs are burned more severely than our external body parts. Ergo, spontaneous human combustion cannot happen. Mm. And we mentioned earlier Elaine Pope, who's an expert in taphonomy, who says that even in the most severe human burn cases, there's always evidence left for analysis. Bone fragments, organs, and so on are left behind. So this brings us back now to the fire scene that the first responders found in the home of Danny Van Zandt in eastern Oklahoma. What Mr. Van Zandt left in his very localized fire was his head, his shoulders, his hands, his feet, and his heart. No other organs. Yeah. That was it. No other organs remained at the fire scene. They were consumed. So immediately, the Van Zandt case alone belies all the opposition that the debunkers inveigh against the reality of spontaneous human combustion. The fire at the Van Zandt scene was very much like the fire that consumed Dr. Bentley here in Pennsylvania back in 1966, one of the classic cases. Basically, Dr. Bentley is the poster child for spontaneous human combustion fire scenes. Mr. Van Zandt's fire consumed his body, aside from the parts that we just mentioned were left behind to prove that the ashes once belonged to a human being. The ceiling directly above the fire that consumed Mr. Van Zandt was pristine. There was no flame damage to it. The first responders looked for an external ignition source. They looked for the nearby stove oven to be turned on. It was not. There was just no external ignition source identifiable that could explain the tremendous destruction to Mr. Van Zandt in the eyes of the first responders. The sheriff was brave and bold enough to state that this could be a case of spontaneous human combustion. He was not willing to rule out that possibility as a law enforcement official, for which he took a tremendous amount of heat online, not surprisingly. This Rube sheriff in eastern Oklahoma, what the hell would he know? Well, what the naysayers and those who attempted to insult the sheriff's reputation did not know was that before he became sheriff of Muldrow County, he had spent 20 years as an arson investigator. He knew what to look for at a fire scene. He knew what to expect to see at a fire scene, and the fire scene that he and his colleagues encountered in the Van Zandt home belied everything that all of them were trained to encounter at a fatal human fire scene.
So, circling back around to a question that Tim Beckley had asked earlier in the program about people who have witnessed apparent spontaneous human combustions. The reports that I have read state that somebody will just burst into flames with no apparent source, they'll be covered in flames almost instantly, and the fire is very resistant to be put out using conventional methods. I know there was one case where they tried pouring water on this woman, and it seemed only to make the fire even hotter. They finally were able to put her out by smothering her with a blanket, but even at that point, it was too late. So, is this something that seems to be coming from inside, the fire within? I know you were saying that a lot of these, reports seem to indicate that the internal organs are completely burnt, which is something that you don't normally see in a conventional, say, like, somebody killed in a house fire.
That's correct. We look at both internal sources for these incredible human incinerations as well as external factors. Internally, we're looking at things like can biochemistry produce the kind of heat necessary to consume a body to this extent? In our book, Ablaze, we postulate dozens of biochemical means by which this might happen. We think many of these fires can best be explained as a bioelectrical or quasi-electrical phenomenon. Because so many of the bodies in the truly classic cases of SHC, Mrs. Reeser, Danny Van Zandt, Dr. Beckley, for example, where the body is completely ashen, dehydrated, it appears to us whatever is the mechanism, internal to the body or external to the body, but not recognized or known by mainstream Western science, we had to dissociate the water molecule. We had to break it down into hydrogen and oxygen and maybe hydroxyl ions. The water in the body, in most human bodies, are about 75% water. To completely dehydrate the body, we have to break apart that water molecule by some means. Biophotolysis, bioelectricity, something that happens at the quantum level, at the subquark level, perhaps. But that has to, whatever the mechanism is, has to explain how the water basically evaporates, becomes vapor.
Well, we're getting a lot of questions, and I know that Tim wants to ask about the Great Chicago Fire, but let me just ask. Karen on Skype wants to know: are there any countries that have a larger than normal reported cases of spontaneous human combustions?
Wonderful question. Thank you. Very insightful. Yes. The answer, as far as we know, is yes. We have the greatest preponderance of cases that fit the definition of spontaneous human combustion in the United Kingdom, Wales, Scotland, and England. Maybe a factor because the British press are more prone to report the sensational aspects of such cases, which is how we find out about them. It may be also because there's something tellurically energetic about that particular part of the planet. What we have done in our book Ablaze is document the astounding discovery that we made in plotting all the cases that we know about of mysterious fires to property and to people and to animals that have occurred in the United Kingdom on a map. And we have discovered that about 83% of these cases of extremely rare phenomena, fires, can be connected by straight alignments, which brings immediately to mind the concept of ley lines that connect megalithic and sacred sites. These ley lines and what we call the fire lanes, the alignments of fire phenomena, do not superimpose, but we think we're dealing with a similar concept here, different types of energy flows in the planet, that if you're in the right place, if you will, at the wrong time when one of these points of energy discharges, your home or your body can spontaneously combust.
All right. Well, so and real quick here, we have two questions that are kind of along the same lines. Mike K wants to know, could some of these incidents be biological warfare, such as blistering agents, flesh-burning gas? And then Troy on Twitter wants to know, did any of these people have maybe a medical device, such as a pacemaker or something like that?
Don't say that. Oh.
Yeah, that's right. Look out, Tim.
Let's go to the last one first. Medical devices. Not to our knowledge. We preface that answer with the observation that it is incredibly difficult not only to investigate these cases because many authorities really want to cover up these fire scenes rather than discuss them honestly and openly with an outside investigator such as ourselves. So it's very difficult to get the kind of information that would even give us the answer to that question. But in the cases that we've been able to, get inside the cases, so to speak, we don't know of any instances where a medical device could be connected to the fire event itself. To the former question, burning agents, certainly, our military has access to burn agents that can do this from a distance. We mentioned earlier about the U.S. Army having the technology to induce thermal heating in an individual at some distance from the device itself. But these are not instances that we have any reason to believe would be associated with the general historical database of SHC. We can't imagine those devices being, present for Danny Van Zandt's burning, for example. And certainly those devices cannot be involved in the cases that date back 100, 200 years, even 50 years ago.
Well, I did want to, pardon the expression, grill you on the article that you did back, I think it was in the early 1980s for UFO Universe, which I was editing. That article has always fascinated me, and I was rereading it today. Mrs. O'Leary's cow was, of course, accused of setting the entire city of Chicago ablaze. At least that's what history tells us. But often history tells us, it gives us incorrect information. Now, I was startled to learn, and I did not know this before reading your article, that Chicago was not the only city in that area of the country that had caught on fire, and you couldn't blame certainly the other incidents, if you could blame the one in Chicago, on Mrs. O'Leary's cow. Can you give us a little summation? I know it's quite a long historical event, but can you clue us in? When did the Chicago fire actually take place, and how widespread was it? And I was even more shocked to learn that in one town, I believe in Wisconsin, that 1,500 people were incinerated by the fire that broke out there. But you tell the tale because you tell it very well.
It's a fascinating tale, and it's one that we don't have time to fully cover in the remaining minutes of the show, but we'll give it a shot. To your first question, the Chicago fire occurred on Sunday evening, October 8, 1871. And as you correctly point out, it's attributed to Mrs. O'Leary's cow. But that is not factual. That is the myth that many people believe to this day. Mrs. O'Leary's cow was exonerated from any culpability of the greater Chicago fire by none other than the city fire marshal, Mr. Williams himself. His men had responded to the O'Leary cow shed. They had that fire under control when, he said, to our surprise, we were informed that a church over 2 blocks to the north was on fire. His crew responded to that fire and put it out. Then there was another, then another, then another. Clearly, they were now being outmanned by these by fires that broke out in multiple parts of the city. As you correctly remember, Timothy, and what is not known, is not part of the mythology of the O'Leary cow saga, is that 220 miles north of Chicago, in a community called Peshtigo in Wisconsin, at the very same time that Chicago was beginning to burn, Peshtigo was likewise going up in flames, with a much larger loss of life. 1,500 people died in the Peshtigo fire. But the fire wasn't limited to Peshtigo and to Chicago. That night of October 8th, there were fires that were erupting separately yet simultaneously throughout the upper Midwest and the upper Great Plains, from Minnesota to Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, the Dakotas, even into Iowa. There were fires that seemed to spontaneously erupt throughout the landscape, throughout communities, causing tremendous loss of property as well as of life. In terms of today's dollar value, we're probably looking at hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage in what we have called the Great American Fire of 1871, not just the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. There are a number of phenomena associated with many of these blazes that we found in the course of our research to be quite curious. Fires in Chicago were erupting in basements. There was a windstorm that night, and many of these fires, and historically the myth is that all these separate widespread blazes, conflagrations even, were the cause of windborne embers carried from one fire location into another. That can certainly be attributed to some of the blazes, but over such a huge geographic area, we don't believe so. The phenomena was found in Peshtigo and in Chicago and elsewhere, where fires were not only erupting, or the locals at the time claimed even that the fires were being transmitted underground, subterraneously. Victims were found burned to powder, i.e. classic SHC-type fire scenes. Other victims were not burned, and yet metal coins in the pockets were found fused together. We've actually seen examples of that in the Peshtigo Museum in Wisconsin. We find that to be quite curious. How could temperatures be so hot as to fuse coinage in a person's pocket and yet not severely burn the individual, him or herself? Odd colors of fire were reported: blue, green, flames, which is certainly not typical of a woodland conflagration fire, were reported historically. Just a whole bunch of odd stuff. If you dig into the contemporaneous reports at the time, you find, what the heck was going on here? Yeah. Certainly something that was far beyond Mrs. O'Leary's cow.
Now we published a book a number of years ago called Darkness of the Gods, which I was hoping to maybe update. And in the book, one of the authors, is kind of like an anthology of mysterious fires and things along this type. One of the authors talked about how the Earth had passed through the tail of a comet and was responsible for this. And of course, you have other incidences like this. I think in Darkness of the Gods, we talked about the Tunguska explosion. What was that, 1908 in Siberia? And there have been other incidences of mysterious fires and things along that line. In fact, there are places now, I understand, that still exist where there are entire towns where people cannot inhabit that area because fires are still ablaze underneath the earth. But I think those are caused by mining disasters or fires, if I'm correct, unless you know some other incidents. But the idea that this might have been an outside source, like a comet or a hail of meteorites or something along that line.
The underground fire that you're referring to most likely is the Centralia fire. It is a mine fire. It is here in Pennsylvania, not too far from the location where we're having this wonderful conversation with you gentlemen tonight. That town had to be abandoned because of the subterranean fires, but that's a normal causative mechanism. Everybody knows how it happened and that it can't be put out. Getting back to the extraterrestrial, if you will, source of these fires, Ignatius Donnelly, back in 1883, posited that the comet Biela was the cause of the Chicago fire, or in this case, the Greater American Conflagration, as we term it. The problem with his supposition is that Biela's comet didn't collide or pass, the Earth didn't pass through the comet's path until 1872, more than a year after the Chicago fire. So that's kind of problematic for that. However, looking at all the evidence that we have amassed for the Greater Chicago Fire of 1871, we do feel that the most plausible explanation, other than if you want to accept the wind-borne ember theory, is an extraterrestrial cause, some energy source external to the planet itself that the Earth passed through, explains the simultaneous eruption of major fires throughout the upper Midwest that night. And when you open the program with that wonderful biblical quote from Isaiah, we have no doubt that somewhere you could find some pastor that morning of October 8th screaming that to his congregation. Little would they know that literally hours later.
I did crib that from your article, I must admit. But okay, so extraterrestrial, but in what obviously some invisible force. Then, in fact, in this Darkness of the Gods book, we have a section in there. There's a fellow. He's deceased. He passed away in his 90s, I believe. Commander Alvin E. Moore, who wrote a book which Gray Barker published many years ago.
Tim, we got about 2 minutes before the show.
In which he talked about invisible islands in the sky and planets that could not be seen. In fact, he said that some of these, that Charles Fort talked about these falls from the sky of fish and meat and so forth were coming from these invisible sky islands that he discussed. But anyway, Larry, we're down to the last few minutes, and we do want to give you the opportunity to tell people where they can obtain your book, and if you have a website. And I know you're on Facebook, and I could have swore that we had been friends for years, but I see that we weren't, and so finally we clicked each other on. But give us a little rundown of what you're up to and the future plans, perhaps.
Oh no! Did we lose Larry?
Inopportune time.
Oh, well. Well, okay. Well, I guess I'll just say, Larry's unofficial website is parascience.com, and his book is Ablaze, The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion. Excellent book, by the way. And
I can imagine the amount of research that went into that volume is just phenomenal. I mean, I don't think anybody has ever put a book, certainly on that subject, together.
All right. Well, we got to wrap it up here, Tim.
Anyway, visit our YouTube site, Mr. UFO Secret Files, and look for us on Amazon.com.
All right. Thanks, Larry. Good night, all.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.